Hello, is this working? Well, welcome everybody. This is to the last keynote of the academic year, one that I've very much been looking forward to for ages, entitled Working on Work. It's a pleasure to have Peggy here to speak on issues related to labor, design, and subjectivity, examining misunderstood worth of architectural workers. She is Professor Emerita of Yale University's School of Architecture and the principal of the firm Deamer Studio, a founding member of the Architecture Lobby, a group advocating for the value of architectural design and labor. She is the editor of Architecture and Capitalism, 1845 to the Present, and The Architect as Worker, Immaterial Labor, The Creative Class and the Politics of Design, and the author of Architecture and Labor. She received the Architectural Record 2018 Women in Architecture Activist Award and the 2021 John Haydock Award. She has taught besides Yale at Cooper Union, Parsons, Princeton, Barnard, and the School of Architecture and Planning at Auckland University. Well, as I said, this is the last keynote of the academic year, our ongoing series featuring internationally prominent architects, designers, and thinkers who are at the forefront of design discourse. Thank you for being here with us, Peggy.
Thank you. Hi. Let me just say it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the very nice introduction. The Berlage has always been a place that I've strived to be associated with because of its influence in architecture theory, so basically this is an honor for me. I'm going to give a talk tonight that I haven't given before, so bear with me if I ramble or if it is too long, but basically I'm going to be going through the different sequence of the kind of work that I have done and the fellow architecture lobby people have done with me to kind of go through chronologically. And the point of this is not so much to give you an autobiography, but I'm hoping that the issues that came to us because they were so obvious, and the sequence of how to think through those problems and how to address them, I hope that going through them sequentially makes them obvious to you as well, and hopefully makes you feel committed to some institutional change as a result of recognizing those issues. So let me just start with, okay, come forward. Okay, it's not moving. Okay, hold on. Okay, I must be doing something weird here. Okay. Great. So I'm just going to start with a quick introduction, and the introduction really has to do with how I got to be doing the work that I'm doing, which we could say basically the aha moments, and then the things that keep me going. So this is just to kind of frame what it is that has kind of motivated the work on doing work. So. Okay, we're just not having a good time here. I'm really trying to do my best here. There we go. Okay, so one of the first of the kind of aha moments, that kind of got me going, was a sign, basically a poster like this, that was in the lobby of the corridor of this law school at Yale University. And basically the poster gave the top 10 family-friendly law firms, and it was organized by the women students at the Yale School of Architecture. And I was struck by the fact that you would never ever see this in a school of architecture. And we could speculate, I still speculate about why that would be the case. But it was even more surprising when I then found out that law firms were crawling over themselves to get onto this list because they wanted to hire the best and the brightest. So instead of the model of architecture students scrambling to work for anybody who will hire them, this was a whole other way of thinking about it, and particularly around the issue of family-friendly. So another one was work that I was doing on kind of craft and detailing in architecture, and reading Ed Form's book, The Details of Modern Architecture. And we could say, no, I need to get my glasses on here. I think it's worth reading this. Insofar as 20th century architects have concerned themselves with the social consequences of their work, they have focused on the way in which buildings affect the behavior of their occupants. Insofar as 19th century architects concern themselves with the social consequences of their work, they focused on the way in which buildings, and particularly their ornaments, affect those who build them. There is perhaps no greater difference between the architects of the 19th century and those of the 20th than each group was so indifferent to the social concerns of the other, which made me really interested in how it is that we lost concern for those who build our architecture, and the thought that in the 21st century we could give equal attention to both. In relationship to that was a conference that was put on by the group called Who Builds Your Architecture? And at that conference, I mean, they've subsequently done these field guides and done a lot of work, but at the very first conference that they gathered, they were hoping to get architects who were having projects built in the Emirates speak to the issue of the bad labor practices of the construction workers who were on those sites. They could not get one architect who was working in the Emirates to come and talk, which in itself was embarrassing. But it also kind of became clear in those of us who did want to talk about that, around why there was this indifference. It just struck me, kind of really as an aha moment, that besides the fact that architects have no contractual relationship to deal with those who build their sites, and that contractual misstep or gap is a problem in and of itself, but besides the fact that there's no contractual obligation, it struck me amazing that one couldn't use our cultural cachet to put pressure on those who were the contractors doing that. But anyway, it was the moment that I also realized that we don't actually identify with those workers because we don't identify with workers at all. And this was really the beginning of thinking about identifying ourselves as architectural workers. Come on, here we go. I'm not sure why this is so funky. There must be a really, really simple way to move these things forward. And I'm not finding it. Okay, I'll find it here. Not finding it here. Just give me a click and let me do it. That's what I was doing. Okay, so the final one is I was at a big conference at the National Museum of Architecture in Washington, D.C., and totally brilliant architectural women were speaking. And at the close of it, they had a question and answer period, and somebody in the audience raised their hand and said that they were thinking about a career in architecture and what might she expect. And one of the speakers said, architecture is not a career, it's a calling. And I just thought, wow, this is ideology, capitalist ideology at its best, which is don't pay me and I'll feel even more holy. So that was another motivation to start rethinking how we identify ourselves as a profession, a discipline, and as workers. So anyway, this is still the introduction. I hope I don't tarry too long, but what has kept me going is research on architecture, the discipline, the practice, and the profession. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is my own research, and a lot of reading around things that are not particularly architectural, but also trying to make issues of capitalism and control, power, money relate to architecture. So a lot of this is my own research, but I have to say a lot of it really is work that I've developed with my colleagues, particularly those in the architecture lobby. And I really wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't in some way speaking from their voices and their work, and I'm indebted to them. So I'm hoping you're familiar with the architecture lobby. The architecture lobby is an organization of architectural workers advocating for the value of architecture in the general public and for architectural work within the discipline, and these are our demands. I'm not going to run through these. I think I'm going to hit these points in other parts of the talk, but basically it's trying to ensure the quality of our work, the respect for our work and the power of our work, as well as understanding the role that architecture plays within the economy, and our potential for rethinking what that economy is like. Okay, so to the heart of the talk, this kind of the different focuses, and again, these are kind of sequential. Basically, the attention was really primarily on organizing work, particularly the work of employees, but eventually kind of all work, and from there into organizing the profession, and from there into organizing education. But I have to say, within each one of these, there also is a kind of sequential move from kind of original let's raise consciousness position onto more focused, I would say, campaigns and institutional critique. And so there's a kind of sequential part to this. We're going to move from consciousness raising to hopefully something that is more strategic. So anyway, organizing work. When we began, with a kind of raising consciousness idea, one of the first things that we did was basically ask for pledges for students that were leaving for the summer or graduating, not to work at an office that had unpaid internships or didn't pay overtime. And the aspiration in this was basically that at some point, when all students and all schools signed this pledge, there really wouldn't be an available cheap workforce that offices could take advantage of. And so from the bottom up, just don't make yourself available. But it was also giving strategies to how to actually interview in a way that could advocate for your own value and your own worth. So these were part of what we were doing. Then there was also kind of protests and performances. The first of these, was in the Venice Biennale in 1914, where we not only read the manifesto that I put up there and didn't read, but we handed out a booklet made up of prayers to San Precario. This is modeled after an Italian prayer for everyday workers to be treated well, but we asked different architects to write their own prayers and put in their own images. We handed those pamphlets out for free. And then in the next Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2016, we had published this was more than a pamphlet, this was a book, Asymmetric Labors, and then again read portions of this book at the Arsenale and the Giardini, again trying to raise consciousness for that. And the idea of being at the Venice Biennale is that this is where leaders of the discipline would all be, and we also knew that this is where a lot of architectural workers were abused by curators of different museums, and so we were hoping to get a attentive audience there. And then another one of raising consciousness was the work that we did with Just Design, which was sending out a questionnaire to employees at different architecture offices, asking these kind of 6 fundamental questions, and then sub-questions within them that had to do with how they would identify the quality of their work. And the idea was to find I would say exceptional architecture offices to work with, but not even exceptional, really decent ones. We were hoping to give certificates similar to LEED certification that would identify for people looking for employment about whether the places that they were looking to work didn't just produce cool objects, but actually looked out for their interest, and came up with an elaborate way of evaluating this. The system was going to be that based on what the employees gave us, we would then go to the employers, kind of verify their attitudes, and produce those certificates. The reality was that we didn't have enough positive response to do certification and make it meaningful, but what we did do is a number of case studies that were published both in our website and at Archinex, so that, again, those firms that really had good employment relationships could be identified. Okay, so now I'm moving on from consciousness raising, and there really was a particular moment in the architecture lobby where we said we're not waiting for other people to do the change because they've now had their consciousness raised, but that we would actually mobilize that change. And so part of this was mobilizing for unions, and this was basically putting out strategies for what does it mean to form a union, why unions were necessary, why unions was not an antithetical idea for architecture, and started that mobilization. The architecture lobby itself is not a union. We were advising about how to do a union, and we succeeded. And so we then got a union affiliate called the Architectural Workers United, who then began the process of trying to unionize specific architecture firms. It maybe isn't known here, but in the U.S. there were 2 major efforts to unionize larger architecture offices that got as far as getting recognition with the National Labor Relations Board, but failed at the last moment when at those firms they couldn't get 50% of the workers to agree, and that's part of the requirement. But there are 2 successes in smaller firms, the Bernheimer Architects and Sage and Coombs Architects. So the first firms in the U.S. that are unionized have been established. It's a major success for all those who have been working at the architecture lobby to get this going. Also, in mobilizing is work that we've done to establish cooperatives and to establish cooperativization as a integral discourse within architecture employment. There are 2 kinds of cooperatives. One is worker-owned, where the workers really do own the work, and the other is what we call network cooperatives. Network cooperatives are basically architecture firms that support each other, that share workers, share resources, have transparent information about employment wages, about fees, but also will share expertise, such that if a small firm doesn't have a certain expertise, but nevertheless has been identified by a developer or a owner for work that they do, that they could go to other small firms that has that missing expertise and really operate with full knowledge in a manner similar to large firms. So again, within the worker-owned cooperatives, the major work being done and how to actually structure them is a complex issue. We used as our model the one worker-owned architecture cooperative in the United States, which is in in Rhode Island, and I'm showing what their system is, just to indicate that setting it up is a complicated issue with complex bylaws, a lot of decisions about who's in, who's out, how you share, how decisions are made. But even more spectacular for me is that one of the architecture lobby people wrote a manual on how to actually set up worker-owned cooperatives, which is very, very practical, is a necessary guide. It's called Practice. It's by Ashlingham, and it's just an important book. For the mobilizing the network cooperatives, again, we were advising different architecture firms who wanted to integrate with other firms that they were collaborating with about how to organize that system. These are two of those networks that we established, and basically the issue here is very similar to setting up the worker cooperatives. You have to be very, very clear about what your goals are, about whether the people coming in or the firms coming in share those goals, whether people who are there first have priority, what role certain leaders will have or certain committees will have. So this is just an indication of that work of organizing around network cooperatives. Okay, moving on to organizing the profession. Again, this too kind of began at a certain level of raising consciousness. Just like we began to have performances and protests at the Venice Biennale to rethink the discipline and work in general, we began to do performances and protests at the American Institute of Architects conventions. And so there we are. You'll notice that we're not inside the conventions because we were not allowed to be there. In fact, we were almost arrested in 2 of the cases for trying to protest within the grounds of the convention. But nevertheless, we were making ourselves visible to everybody who was going in and out of the AIA convention. And again, this is just to make clear that we should not be pleased about how our profession handles workers and should actually devote some attention to it. So this led to a more focused institutional critique. This one in particular began when, after Trump was elected in 2016, the AIA came out with a statement saying, "We support the work of the Trump administration. We're here to do your bidding. Give us work." There was, to the profession's credit, an outcry of that, whereupon the AIA backtracked and said, we do have values, and came up with a statement, "Where architects stand, a statement of our values." It was in response to that a number of us wrote a kind of analysis of where we thought, even with these apologies and whatever, the AIA was lacking in anything material. And basically what we identified, amongst other things, is where the AIA was stuck. And one was avoidance of conditions that affect employees. In fact, you won't even see the word employee anywhere in the AIA. We're all potential architects. 2, an avoidance of issues that are ethically or politically difficult when the goal is securing work from the government at all costs, and so it avoids any difficult issues whatsoever. A tilting to large firms that deliver the most members, and again, large firms will pay for their employees to be members of the AIA, whether the employees want to be members or not, and so delivering those members gives the large firms a huge advantage. Avoidance of addressing conditions that shape the profession in the 21st century, which is to say technology or the changing economy. You can read their positions, and it comes from early 20th century. And to me, most interesting was extending the race to the bottom with competition for lower and lower fees beyond the competition imposed by antitrust laws. I've done a lot of work on antitrust laws, which in the United States insist that firms, whether they're architecture or not, have to compete against each other. And I think we all know that in architecture what that means is that if you go for a job and indicate that you're going to be charging 8% of the cost of construction, they'll say, oh, I just interviewed another firm. They said they do 6% of cost of construction. We love your work, but can't you come down to 6? Yes, come down to 6, want the job. That's the race to the bottom that we're experiencing. I don't know whether it's true here in the Netherlands, but that's how it works in the US. But besides antitrust laws, insisting that that happens, at the AIA national conventions, in one particular one, they had as their keynote speakers 2 firms who were teaching the architects gathered there about how to deliver more and charge less. I want you to hear that. How to deliver more and charge less, which means that they were teaching the architects how to compete better as opposed to how to argue for their value. So that was troubling. So from there, because I was trying to figure out how our American Professional Architectural Association, the AIA, might do better and get examples from other nations' professional architectural association, I began to do comparative research. You can see the different categories where I had identified certain issues that might make a professional organization more relevant to society, more powerful in the government, more powerful in the public. But the bottom line here was that the profession was organized so differently in the different countries that there simply was no way that you can import certain aspects from one country's professional organizations to the U.S. But I do want you to identify here the raison d'etre of the professional organization, which is to say, in the U.S., the AIA is a fraternal organization, which means it's mostly there to try and get work, but you don't have to be a member of the AIA. It's just a place where you all learn to tell each other that you're doing great. In France, the professional organization is part of the government, which gives it a lot of power. And that's one of the reasons the competitions there work so well, and that one can see actually a kind of concern for the architecture fabric. But when the government doesn't work for you, there are also problems with that. In Germany, the kind of raison d'etre is to raise the technical standards of the architecture profession and have it be part of its kind of technological hegemony. And then in Sweden, where the professional organization is a union, and the union is part of the government, and not just that, but the professional organization is a union of employees, not just employers. And so there are just all these huge differences, all of which I have to say made the American system look particularly bad. But the real thing that I noticed was in each country, the profession is organized to support their country's cultural and economic hegemony. And so in that way, I was kind of trying to find the national characteristics of those different countries. And so we can hear in the US, privatization, an apolitical system of culture, fragmentation, individuality. In France, centralized republicanism, political personalities, dirigism. Dirigism is a form of capitalism that works very closely with a top-down system of government. In Germany, it's a system of state order, and so the profession is there to kind of support that system of state order and its interest in technological expertise and experts. And in Sweden, a system of unionization. So it struck me that there's just not even a consistent notion of architecture going on here, which is a problem when we have global crises, which is in the U.S., architecture is an elitist commodity. In France, architecture is around cultural hegemony. Think about Mitterrand's Grand Projet. In Germany, architecture is about technological hegemony, and in Sweden, architecture is about a kind of knowledge industry. If you know anything about Sweden, they pride themselves in different forms of organizing the workforce, and so architecture fits into that system. From there, moving on to kind of the third layer of institutional critique, which is to question professionalism altogether. I really began to think that what are the advantages of being a profession, in as much as one of the things in the United States, anyway, that you're excluded from is having to pay overtime and follow other kind of normal labor laws. So what I began to see is both from the left and the right, there were critiques of professionalism. And from the left, which is kind of exemplified by the work by Magali Sarfati Larson, it really is the claim that professionalism is kind of an outmoded 19th century phenomena that had a raison d'etre at the time that it was invented, but is no longer the case. As she says, professionalism, a construct of liberal capitalism, had three simultaneous goals: to ensure a guiding elite knowledge sector, to harken back to pre-capitalist ideals of craftsmanship, universal protection of social fabric, and noblesse oblige, and to offer conventions of standardization, scientific and cognitive rationality, and a progressive division of labor. All of which the implication is are no longer of value in the 21st century. More on the right is a critique that professions are a form of monopoly and a way of protecting an industry and ensuring that it doesn't have to operate on the free market. So one of the more interesting texts now by the Suskins in The Future of the Professions is basically saying that in this kind of economy, and we can call that the kind of knowledge economy, where knowledge no longer sticks within certain disciplinary silos, the sharing of information across boundaries is absolutely essential for moving an economy or a nation's economy forward, and professions are exactly about blocking that. If you think about professionalisms, it's a way of keeping a boundary of certain people are in, people with a certain kind of knowledge are in, those who don't share it are out, and that's exactly the kind of boundaries that the Suskins say need to be broken. So I have become an advocate of deprofessionalization. Okay, last, organizing education. I hope that you kind of recognize that this circles back to some of the original work where we were trying to get students who were graduating not to work for bad firms, about how to interview, how to get students to think better of themselves as they went out to the workforce. And so that consciousness raising has kind of already been part of what you've seen. So I'll go directly to mobilizing. The first form of mobilizing was the architecture lobby establishing the Architecture Beyond Capitalism summer school, the ABC school. This was our attempt to begin to address a number of things. One, we had to teach the importance of architecture's place within capitalism, but it also was a way, it's an online school, it lasted 6 weeks, no accreditation, no fees paid, you just had to demonstrate your commitment to doing it. yeah, so we had 447 applicants. We had 223 offered spots. We had 172 registered participants and 42 registered auditors. The difference between participants and auditors being that the participants had to fulfill assignments and the auditors didn't. And basically we got students, we got academics, we got journalists, we got nonprofit workers, we got practitioners. And it for us was a real platform for another kind of school. Just to say, part of the goal here is a kind of global form of education. I think more and more this became a concern for me and for those of us in the lobby about how to get out of your nation-building understanding of architecture profession or a school's own particular hegemony that works within that nation-state, but how you could actually get students and practitioners and academics from other countries to really share their experiences. In some way, this was a way of, I don't want to say proving, but addressing the fact that the local absolutely matters. We needed to know other experiences, but also that at the bottom of all this, particularities of the local, there are fundamental global issues that we all share. So, just as a kind of basis for the rationale for Architecture Beyond Capitalism, the premise was that architecture schools do not teach what and how they ethically could or should. And the idea that if capitalism is a system by which Western and white supremacy was established and is now perpetuated, what might architecture beyond capitalism be like? What steps are required to get there? So that was the premise, and still is the premise. We've had 3 iterations. We're on to the 4th of the architecture of the ABC school, but this is consistently the premise. But in 2001, again, there were 3 different topics that we talked about. The first was capitalism, the second was labor, and the third was collectives. Each of these subjects lasted for 2 weeks, and each of those had an initial week of speakers talking about the issues, and then a second week of looking at the assignments that students were doing between the first and the second week, addressing either capitalism, labor, or the collectives sequentially. And just to say the way that it worked, again, there was speakers and then discussion around the speakers in the first week, then we gave the assignments, and then there was in the second week what we called the salon discussion, where people put up their work. Examples of the work that they put up. This was the assignment that came from the capitalism session, where we asked students to do power mapping of the production, distribution, and consumption of a product of their choice. Some people did Crocs, some people did fertilizers, some people did books, but these are various examples of power maps where we were trying to get all the participants to recognize that things come in relationship to power, and much of that is economic power or governmental support, and to understand exactly the process by which we do things. This is kind of a model for understanding the power relationships that operate within the discipline and within the profession in general. So the next year, in 22, we concentrated on studio. So if 2021 gave a really broad stroke, a very broad stroke about architecture education, we zoned in on what we thought was the particular culprit in architecture education, which is studio, and how studio is taught. We also made a change for how we organized this. This wasn't over 6 weeks, it was over 1 week, but with 3, 4, or 5 sessions a week that would be more sympathetic to different time zones. But it also was we didn't identify the speakers, we didn't identify the themes other than studio as a big basket, but asked participants to come up with their own observations and establish their own, basically, 2 hours of participation and discussion. The only requirement was that nobody could lecture. It had to be a participatory 2 hours. So we also were trying to get rid of the idea that we as ABC organizers knew better or knew what needed to be talked about, but to really see ground up what were the issues at the table. So this is the schedule that happened over that week and the various themes that were brought up. And basically, we said to those interested in participating, it could have to do with anything in studio, how studio was taught, where studio was taught, who it was being taught to, why it was being taught, how much technology mattered, different relationships between students and tutors. Basically, anything was up for grabs. In the third year, which was called Future Belonging, the idea was that we wanted anyone interested in the discipline to talk about what we might call an ideal future, to just speculate about how we get to a different sense of belonging to the future and of participating in the future. And the center here was us creating what we call a hub or a repository, so the people who were participants in this would lodge their aspirations and their work within a repository that was going to be free access and would basically be a library for the future. And this hub was organized around a kind of quadrant of different kinds of speculation, speculative and experimental, navigational and reorienting, applied and participatory, or theoretical and philosophical. We were interested in any and all of those. And then this year, which is called the ABC, Hacking the Institution, we're basically changing what we think of as a school, which is that we are helping different schools. Let me put that again. We're helping students, adjunct faculty, even possible administrators, in hacking the curriculum and the system of hierarchies that they have in their institutions. So what the lobby is doing is identifying different schools, either by country or by issue, so that they talk to each other and can support each other. Check in on them as they develop a platform over the this summer and fall semester, such that in the spring semester of 25, they can identify the institutional changes, the curriculum changes, the programs that they've actually been able to employ. So that's going on now. And then finally, as part of mobilizing, organizing education, 7 of us have written the Organizer's Guide to Architecture Education, which will come out in July. And this book is organized in 3 different parts. The first is organizing itself. What is organizing? What is organizing in the academy? What is organizing in architecture in the academy? Oops, go back. And in some way, it identifies that organizing is a necessary part of education to understand ourselves as future practitioners, needing to organize the community, organize our construction workers, organize the powers that be, in order to come up with programs that are not made by private development, as in organize such that we actually influence what is built and not just decorating what is built, as in how it is built. And that takes organizing. So the idea is you need those skills when you're going to practice, but even within schools, in order to take control of your education, organizing is something that needs to be put in place. The second part divides the areas of organizing into 4 different scales: small, medium, whoa, go back. How did that happen? Small, which has to do with studio, medium that has to do with curriculum, large that has to do with the university, and extra large, the nation state, such that organizing within those takes a particular form. In studio, we're suggesting that it's not like you're going to be organizing your particular section with your particular tutor, although you could, but it's more that the studio, because of the intimacies that you have with your critic, with your design projects, with each other, is where a different kind of subjectivity can be made, different from the one that now exists, which is individualistic, competitive, kind of isolated, and very often degrading to a particular individual as they present their work and have critics do pot shots at them. A different kind of subject who automatically sees that they're in a hopefully productive relationship with their critic, a productive relationship, a shared relationship with their studio colleagues, but also understand that in the programs that they're working on in their studio, that there's a whole network of individuals that need to be cared about and attended to relationally, and whether that has to do with those that are going to be building your project, or those that are helping you as consultants for that, or the community in which it's going to be built, or the people who are going to live in the building, which very often is not the people who are building it, or also just what the neighborhood itself thinks, that this is a much larger set of subjectivities that you want to place yourself in relationship to, and studio is the place to kind of reorient it, that kind of pre-organized individual. The medium is curriculum, and again, in the curriculum is really the place where one can begin to think about organizing fellow students, fellow critics, even some administrators, about how to get out of disciplinary silos, the usual breakdown between studio and design, history theory, structures, professional practice, mechanical systems, to no longer think of those as prioritizing their own disciplinary history and raison d'etre, but to think together around how they support each other so that students work on problems that need solving with all of those different expertises coming to bear on a particular project. But it also, in a way, is a way of beginning to organize how to transcend systems of accreditation. Systems of accreditation are very often the reason that we have those administrative silos. And so part of it is also to really work against larger administrative systems. Large, the university, this is basically how to organize so that your particular school of architecture, say, isn't divided from the law school, say, where information that lawyers have about how to go about changing zoning or guaranteeing that the original indigenous owners' lands won't be taken, that you work together for problems. But it also is a way of organizing around what is now basically, I think we all know this, the neoliberal, market-driven, business-oriented idea of knowledge production, which is the staple of universities today. And then finally, the nation state, which is to say that to organize around a discipline that is only serving the nation state's hegemony. And this in some way goes back to what I was talking about with professional organizations that basically are interested in their country's hegemony, to no longer think about a discipline that serves that, but exactly could produce architectural workers, similar to Doctors Without Borders, who know how to operate in that way, or who have the expertise to be on a UN panel about refugees or climate change, places where architects just are not present now, and we need to train for that. So that's that. Part 3 is what we call the expanded field, and this is basically to say if Part 2 has been trying to get architects to think beyond their traditional self, beyond their traditional selves. When you kind of get to that place where you're thinking beyond the nation state, you kind of realize that many, many thinkers are thinking this way well beyond architecture, getting there, such that, for example, systems thinking, if we want to think about this in a kind of synchronic fashion, systems thinking is absolutely dealing with this and has been dealing with this forever, where architecture is understood within a playing field of many, many other attributes, and they all are related, but also indigenous thinking, that if we think about that diachronically, has a totally different understanding of time and our responsibility to past generations and future generations, which really in some way is not efficiency focused, but is, we could say, spiritually focused, or certainly beyond the planet focus. So that's that. So this quick, conclusion. Just some concluding words about organizing itself. Don't do that. Organizing, which has clearly been the theme here, is something that is on my mind and is important to me just because I knew nothing about it. I have learned along the way, and I'm still learning. And I think one of the things that keeps me so attached to this work is how much I keep learning and how much I need to know. I basically thought that once we were identifying horrible labor conditions in architecture, and this is embarrassing, that the New York Times architecture critic would write a big article about it, the profession would change, everything would be good. The architecture lobby, 1-year project, this is how long it takes to raise consciousness and everything. It's like, not true. And so basically along the way, we've been dependent on union organizers, faculty and students who've been part of their unions within the schools, union organizers within construction, and absolutely that has been part of what we've had to incorporate. The other is that, this is kind of obvious within the term of organizing, but, and I kind of learned this because I was batting my head against the wall with my particular deans at Yale. Why so sexist? Why so privileged? As long as you're talking on your own, you're just seen as a bitch. If you're a woman. You can't do this alone. You have to get a group around you. You have to develop a community. So that's just a basis. But also that organizing is more than just cooperating and developing a community. It's really being strategic. And it's strategic in a way that activism itself isn't, because it's about power. How do you get power, and how do you not abuse power? So organizing itself is something to be worked on. I have this diagram up here, just, not because I want you to know how the architecture lobby is organized, but just to kind of show you the complexity of it. It doesn't happen naturally. It takes work. And so it's a nonprofit. In fact, it's 2 nonprofits. Why is it a nonprofit? Because you can't have a bank account if you're not a nonprofit. My feeling was that the architecture lobby should be like the Guerrilla Girls, who I don't think are a nonprofit, but nevertheless, there we are. This is what comes with the territory. But it's 2 nonprofits because one can get people to donate with a tax deduction, and the other one you can advocate politically, and those 2 don't mix. So these are just things that are handed to us that you need to learn and manipulate. In a certain way. But finally, I also want to just say, there are other things about organizing that have to do with kind of more personal, spiritual things. And one is that, oh, there we go, thank you. that you need to be patient. You need to have faith that the work that comes when you're all struggling and disagreeing will be better than any one person's, and I consistently learn that. It means that you never blame anybody for having bad faith. You assume that even if you disagree around tactics, you're never disagreeing about the motivation. So there's sympathy for those disagreements. You basically have to have meetings that are always scheduled so that people know when they are, and it's not just at the mercy of who's going to be available that week. You count on there being a place for people to go. You make it fun. If it's not fun, people don't want to go, either in person or online. You give assignments so that people know what to do, and you give assignments so that progress is made, because people, particularly volunteers, aren't going to keep coming if they're wasting their time and nothing's getting done. So these are things that I've learned. Anyway, so here we are. Thank you very much. Workers of the World Unite.
Thank you. Questions?
Well, thank you for your talk today. I think it was very interesting. And I just had a question about, well, we know that in many, and at least in the US, unions typically don't form because of a sort of lack of interest from the
I don't think your
employees.
mic is working.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. They usually don't form from a sort of lack of interest from the actual employees, and I was just curious, how do you see this sort of issue coming that happens? Because I know typically when unions start to form, there's actually never, they actually have a low sort of interest rate from the interest expressed from the sort of employees of the company or the sort of industry. And I was just, yeah, I was curious how you see this, or if you kind of...
I mean, I can tell you what happened with those two large firms, you know, that started to unionize and then failed to follow through. And I hope this answers your question, but in order to even get to the place where the National Labor Relations Board in the U.S. will officially then start the ballot, you have to have 30% of the workers who agree to that being of interest. Getting 30% of the workers, we might think no problem, but many workers don't actually identify that way. But let's just say 30% would or do. But the reality is you need to know that when the official vote comes down from the National Labor Relations Board, 50% have to do it. So you don't even go if you don't have 50%, even though 30 is the threshold. What happens between that first one, where it gets to the National Relations Board, it becomes public. Up until then, the partners, the employers have no idea. Supposedly this is happening. Everyone's working very, very subtly. There's techniques about how to do that. Who you go to, how you have the conversations, where you have the conversations. This is union organizing. What happens between that and the future assembly is the employers then get their lawyers and they begin their campaign, the anti-union campaign. And basically the general thing is, why do you want a third party to come between you employees and us employees? We're here, our door is open, you don't need to have that thing, do it. And by the way, haven't you seen that we do blah, 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 and we'll give you blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's when people who originally would have said yes, unionize, no longer do. So does that answer your question?
And I was also just sort of interested in this idea of how do you kind of raise maybe awareness to empower these sort of workers, because I mean, I'm speaking for the U.S., but I think a lot of people acknowledge there's a sort of toxic work culture. But how do you sort of rectify that by then kind of giving employees the tools when, you know, when unions do try to form and then there's such a low interest expressed, I guess, by employees.
I don't know if you know the work of Jane McAlevey, who is probably the main advocate and with lots of successes of organizing unions, particularly the teachers' unions. But a number of us took her online class, and the part of that is how do you identify people in the firm who are going to be persuasive, and the point in that is it's not the most politically adamant at all. It may not even be the person who at that point is committed, but it is the person who other employees listen to. And then you begin to have conversations with that person, and it's always a matter of how do you personally gain from thinking about this or systems. It goes straight to not the value or the ethics, it's just what do you have to do. Then you go to somebody else who, again, is not the most outspoken, but the one who seems to be in a different series of communal groups, who can identify a common threshold from people at kind of with different jobs and whatever, and only then do you then begin to get the person who's the loudest and the strongest, whatever. I mean, are these the kind of tactics that you're talking about?
Yeah.
And it, again, totally secret.
Yeah.
I mean, secret in the sense that it's not happening at the lunch table in the office. Yeah.
Of course. Okay, thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello?
Kind of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. So I guess I'm still in the aha moment right now, and I wonder, because you use the law school or the law firm as one of the entry point to talk about how architects don't identify themselves as workers, and then also in a way how hard it is to unionize in the architecture field in the United States. And I wonder if you have any other professions that you will actively compare to or use as like a way of, these two, like architects are very similar in that aspect with these professions that already are unionized, or these are the examples that architects are very unlikely to behave as, to compare themselves in the overall workers' movement and also in the process of unionization. Yeah, that's my question. Basically, how do we as architects identify ourselves as workers among other workers, and then the specifics that come with it?
My answer is basically no, but a little bit of yes. The work that I've done on antitrust laws in some way gave me an entree around how other professions are dealing with imposed competition that antitrust laws insist upon. And one of the things is that doctors, for example, almost all belong to the AMA because they believe that the AMA, up until recently, and there's criticism now, actually does do work for them, does do social work for them. And so they see that in some way is a place where as a group that they can do it. I mean, that's not workplace stuff, but, likewise, engineers, it's not like we have surveyed them, but because we've been working with engineers in terms of how to develop a kind of system where everyone who is interested in producing a building, constructors, engineers, fabricators, architects, we've worked with them, are just shocked by our labor practices. And so this is all kind of word of mouth, but it happens often enough. It's kind of like, you're kidding me. You're not going home at 6. You're expected to go in on Saturdays and Sundays. And so in that way, we know about that. But just to say, again, this is indirect, but it's just kind of comparative information. One of the ways to get around antitrust laws that make you compete, the main way is legislation. Really, you can't argue that competing hurts not just the profession, but will hurt the products that you give. You can't do that in antitrust laws. You have to legislate that particular competition isn't good. you can imagine that there aren't architects who are going to convince their legislators that they need to do this. But another way is to have a third party describe the condition when they're not advocating for it. And so the lawyers actually at one point had a third party, and again, it wasn't the law board, LB, or whatever it is, describe what corporate firms were paying their first-year employees. That is not collusional because it's not, no one is organizing, getting a thing. When that information came out, all the law firms went to the top pay. They all wanted to compete. They all went to the top pay. We don't have an organization like that. And we can ask why we don't have an organization like that. We can try to identify what that organization would be, but we don't have it. In the U.S., it could be the ACSA. They're not doing it. It could be NCARB. They're not doing it. It could be NAB. They're not doing it. In some way, that's kind of an indication of power within a certain profession. Real estate, we might know that all realtors get 6%. Isn't that collusion? Isn't that anti? Well, the reason that that works, and it's actually just been challenged in the U.S., the reason that that works is because most realtors both represent buyers and sellers, and so they know that if they misbehave consistently for a buyer, they won't get anyone to come in and help them as the seller. So again, it's implicit collusion, which is not illegal. Anyway, these probably more detail than you want to know, but it's the type of stuff that gets interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for this talk, and I think this topic is quite interesting. And I'm curious. I guess I don't quite know my question, but maybe more a topic that I would love for you to talk more about, which is relationship of architecture and time, and specifically in the academic world. And as a student, it hit me early on that, especially in the U.S., architecture as a major was called architorture, and there is such a relationship of really intense working. As a student, that to me has always stood out as being very easy then to take into the profession. It's kind of like if you can make it from the beginning, then it's hard to change that relationship to time. So I'm just curious if you could speak more about that, or if that's come up in some of the conversations and the talk that you've done in the academic world and those changes.
What you're describing is kind of at the heart of what we're hoping to change. And I think in some way, the whole book, The Organizer's Guide to Architecture Education, is a way of breaking that spell. There's so many things about how to break that, which is the kinds of assignments that you give, about making sure that you don't allow all-nighters. I had my students sign a contract with me that they would not, within the 13 weeks of studio, ever do an all-nighter. I would have students hand in their work the night before review at a certain time, and then take them out to a bar to make sure that they were not going to come back and do anything. Have a kind of discussion when you put your work up that isn't just about the amount of work or the aesthetic virtuosity, but really emphasizes the quality of thought, so that students who are not just the high competitive ones, but are the thought ones, get recognized. Those are all things that need to be institutionally changed. But part of what I get interested in is what is the relationship between those kind of practical things and ideology. Does ideology need to change first? Which is, I know I went into architecture, it's like, oh my God, I'm going to be one of those people and it changed the world, and I love to design, and my things are going to go out there in the world, and lucky world to get my objects, and all that stuff. I mean, I don't think I understood the bad labor practices, but there was nevertheless this notion of individual satisfaction and stardom and whatever. And then I go into architecture. Does that need to change first before we then are all convinced that we can maybe put in place some of those more practical things, or do those practical things need to be put in place so that people who are entering the profession don't even have that? They think, I want to be an architect because I can see how much I get to work with real people that matter, how I get to work with the site that's on the ground, how I get to work with history because their buildings are permanent, I get to work with the community that cares. I want to be that person. It's a different come on. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope it's gonna sound okay. But my question gonna be about spatial arrangement of lobby. So the lobby, how does it organize spatially? Where do you sit? How do you work? Do you move from place to place or work remotely? Or maybe you have a specific place dedicated for lobby, or that works something like a guild? I don't know. Can you reflect on that? Because I was curious about the way, what is behind those diagrams?
I should have explained those. It's a very good question. Yes, I should have explained that. Basically, it works in chapters, which are local, in particular cities or particular schools of architecture, and it works by campaigns, and the campaigns. And so, shall I call up that diagram? So what you're seeing here at the bottom level, which is really what you should be looking at, the rest of it is kind of blah, blah, blah about nonprofits. But you'll see that there are New York, Bay Area, Iowa, but then you'll see certain with hashtag Green New Deal, hashtag racial justice, hashtag unionizing, hashtag Me Too. Those are campaigns. And the local chapters can either meet physically or they can meet virtually. And they used to meet almost always physically in one place until the pandemic, and then they met virtually, and now we're transitioning back to meeting in person. The campaigns, because they generally transcend a particular thing, they really have to do with unionization. People from East Coast, West Coast, whatever, they're meeting virtually. So it's a mix that way. The people who make it to the organizing committee are people who head up the campaigns or are the chapter stewards from the local campaign. And the organizing committee always meets virtually. And that's how they make their decisions about where money's going to go, what to do. Every 2 years we have a Congress, and the Congress meets in person. And we try, one of the monetary things that we need to do is try and get financial support for people who can't afford to go to the Congress physically, and give them support to do that. So then the organizing committee is really, in some ways, the arena where, let's say, in the Bay Area basically became particularly interested in housing. And so at what point is their interest in housing something that isn't just their local thing, but will rise to the level of a campaign that transcends that particular place? And once it's identified as a campaign, then it's kind of open for money, for extra support, for gathering other people and whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I wanted to ask you about competitions, because you spoke about competitiveness, but I was curious because from my experience working in, let's say, like mostly European offices, I could observe a lot of surplus kind of energy and labor and kind of wasted effort that goes into the culture of competition with very minimal result actually, let's say, succeeding within the framework of what success is in the industry. And then I was thinking that same competitiveness that is, let's say, promoted in school, that gets translated almost directly towards this competition-based structure between offices, right, and competing against each other. But on the other hand, though, it also does provide for some completely unknown, let's say, studios, some window of opportunity to, let's say, promote their work. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, should the system, let's say, stay in place but be changed? Should it be replaced completely with something else, or what do you think about?
Now, I guess there are two parts to that. One is the office that kind of doesn't function efficiently, where knowledge from one project isn't shared to those on another project, or you're just kind of throwing workers at certain things and not taking much account as to the hours that are being spent and when it works and when it doesn't. I mean, that, to me, that's basically an office and a profession built on those offices that work as if it's still in school and you're in the studio, which is like ridiculous. And so just, basic business planning would be helpful. And that takes not thinking of money as a dirty word, and how to actually run a business fairly efficiently. So that's essential. But the other is kind of what I was trying to convey with the cooperative network, which is expertise from one office, whether that's organizational expertise or whether that's the best advice about a lawyer or the best advice about an engineer, or sharing a publicity agent or whatever, that you help each other as opposed to competing each other and keeping that knowledge to yourself. Sharing employees such that when you're losing a job or a job is put on hold but you don't want to fire somebody, you reach out to the network and say, I have 3 workers who probably need something to do for 6 months. Can you help? That simple act means that you're being very transparent about what you're paying them. You're being very transparent about the hours that you're expecting that work to work, such that when it's translated to the other one, they're not going to be surprised. All of that is helping each other out as opposed to competing. You might say that that's idealistic, but it seems to me that we pretty quickly can recognize that the profession of architecture is quickly becoming irrelevant because we're just seen as decorating developers' bad projects. So the more that we can help each other be a relevant discipline and a relevant practice, the better off we're going to be.
Thank you very much, Peggy. I was wondering if you knew the project that Naomi Stead did with Parla recently in Australia, where they surveyed, I think, over 2,000 architectural workers. And it's a project on well-being. And she's been working with statisticians and sociologists who...
Is this Parla?
Yeah. So it's part of Parla, but it's also Naomi's own project. Anyway, they got the results back from the survey. And the statisticians were completely blown away because they were saying that this level of the low levels of well-being that were reported by architects and levels of stress and this kind of thing were at the level only seen in war-torn and developing nations. So it's really, a very, very big problem.
Yeah. And
I was wondering, sort of historically, if you can pinpoint the moment where it all went wrong, because you've talked about neoliberalism and this in the knowledge economy, but I'm thinking in the UK it was quite clear when they deregulated the architectural profession under Margaret Thatcher. But I'm wondering if there was a moment in the US that you can sort of think of where this happened.
I guess we could see it starting earlier with the construction of professions, but I would basically identify exactly the same thing. It's all in the 70s with neoliberalism, and so it's Thatcher in the UK and it's Reagan in the US. Before that, the professions were not part of antitrust laws, and they were excluded from it. They were considered liberal professions, it kind of became clear within this period of deregulation that professions were a monopoly, and that it needed to no longer be exempt from antitrust laws. And there were, so not just architecture, but all the professions, were hit with that. And it's just interesting, again, tell me if I'm going down a rabbit hole here, too much information, but it was, the way the antitrust laws work in the United States is basically the Department of Justice comes and says, we see that basically your code of ethics, they go after the code of ethics because the code of ethics says that we're serving society, and basically implicitly saying, if we compete against each other, we can't serve society well. We have a larger mission. We have a larger social mission. They went after the codes of ethics in all the professions. Engineering alone, when it was told to change their things and not accept what's called a consent decree, which means you're not going to be found guilty as a profession for doing that. You're just going to change your ways, and they're going to make sure you're going to change your ways. Engineering said, no, we're going to bring this to court. And they brought it to court because they said that if you do this, what's going to happen to the profession is that we're going to come up with quick solutions for engineering, which is quick solution isn't a sloppy one, it's over-engineered. It's over-engineered. And so that they're not going to actually finesse things so that it could be more affordable, more reasonable. They're just going in. But they were trying to argue that does not help the clients. It just doesn't help the clients. They lost the case, boom, that was it. And for all the other professions, it was an example of why you don't try and go head-to-head with the Department of Justice. But anyways, it's the same period. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your lecture. I was wondering something now in relation to what Amy was asking also. I was wondering if you have some segregated data or campaigns in relation to migration, the migration of architectural workers, because in countries like Spain or Greece, where the crisis in 2008 really hit the building industry, this was a real issue. Entire generations of young architects migrated to Northern Europe, Western Europe, etc. So, I was wondering if from your perspective and your work, you have dealt with this issue and you have some data.
I want to say, not me personally and the lobby only indirectly, but in the ABC school for 2023, where we were really trying to get a global perspective on how to imagine the future. This came up with participants from Greece, and it came up with participants from Turkey. So one of the best examples of what's now happening in ABC 24-25 is that the students and adjunct faculty that are teaching in schools in Turkey are trying to address that particular question, how in some way to prepare for that and redirect not just education, but practitioners for that. And so I can't in any way claim that, but it's been set off, and I know that it's a concern for those countries.
Hi, thank you for your lecture and also inspiring work. I was wondering, besides, because I know you've been looking into the profession, but besides the profession, if you have been curious or interested in looking into the architectural scholars as workers, for example, at least in this university, we see how specifically in this faculty we have scholars, PhDs doing work that is not funded, but in other faculties they have funds from corporations and so on. So here also architectural research can be singled out, being in a precarious condition because of lack of funding and so on. So I don't know if you have been curious about
the asymmetric labors book that I showed way back when at the Venice Biennale. It was the white book, asymmetric labors. That was all contributions from academics asking them how do they value their work. And value their work could be interpreted in any way, in terms of what they're giving their students, how they're directing their particular program, how it's paid, how it's not paid, how they're fighting for better paid. Basically, that book became an opportunity for mostly adjuncts to complain about that exact issue. So that's not a solution, but faculty found a common voice, and that was basically theoretical. That's theoretical and theory, people teaching theory, and history. But right now, an offshoot. I want to say an offshoot is not really an offshoot of the lobby, but in the diagrams that I was showing about cooperative networks, one of those diagrams is called WIP. It's Women in Progress, or there are various interpretations of WIP. The founder of that particular network is now going through and trying to get all adjunct faculties that she can get a hold of to identify the nature of their contract, the nature of their salary, how much security they don't have, how long their contracts are for, in order to begin to mobilize that. So I don't want to take responsibility for that, but I feel like it's in the network of the people who are, in this world. Yeah.
Thank you.